Hello and welcome to another edition of Local Heroes. Today we're on the Battleship Alabama in Mobile, Alabama, at Battleship Memorial Park. It's a fun-filled family destination that you don't want to miss. It's immersed in history, so bring your family and come see this historic ship. Today we're talking to Mr. Chuck Wheeler on Local Heroes. So stand by, come back, and you'll hear more of an interesting Local Heroes story. Welcome back to Local Heroes. We're talking with Mr. Chuck Wheeler. He was a rear seat gunner on an SBD and he was on the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. Welcome to Local Heroes, Mr. Wheeler.
Well, thank you, sir, and it really does my heart good to be here, because I believe that by being here I have an opportunity to wave the flag a little bit and preach a little patriotism.
Well, we're so glad you're here. Could you tell us, Mr. Wheeler, how you got into the Navy, or what time frame it was when you joined the Navy? Was it 1940?
In 1938, as you know, the war clouds were rumbling in Europe, just coming out of the Depression, and I didn't have any money. I didn't know anybody that had any money, so my buddy come up to me one day and said, "How would you like to go with me? I'm going to go see about joining the Navy." So we did. And when I took my examinations, the physical examination and also the IQs and the mental examinations and whatnot, the doctor told me, he says, "We can't use you." He says, "because your tonsils are bad, and before you can get in the Navy, you got to get your tonsils fixed." Removed them, and that really put me back a little bit. And so I was working in digging post hole for rural telephone lines by hand, and I saved up $18 and finally got my tonsils taken care of and went back, and he said, "Okay, you're on your way," and that was in 1940. But it was in 1939 that I inquired. So they sent me to San Diego boot camp, and after boot camp I had the opportunity to attend an aviation gunnery school, and then they told me, "We're going to put you aboard the Enterprise." But it's kind of interesting to show you how the Navy was a little bit screwed up in those days. My original orders were to go aboard the Yorktown. The Yorktown was CV5. So here again, nobody knew where the Yorktown was located. Supposedly, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a deal with Churchill, and he took a couple of battleships from the fleet at Pearl Harbor and the carrier Yorktown and a few cruisers, and sent them through the canal and turned them over to the East Coast. So I went aboard the Enterprise, and then somebody felt sorry for me. I was in the X division, and all they did was clean heads and pick up dirt and what jobs that nobody else wanted to do. And he felt sorry for me, and he said, "How would you like to just stay aboard the Enterprise?" And how lucky I was that I got to stay aboard the Enterprise, because once again, I feel in my heart that I was not the best student in the world, and I wasn't the smartest guy in the world, but if I ever did anything that I'm proud of, was my service aboard the Enterprise, and the fact that I personally loaded the bombs on our dive bombers that blew up the Imperial Japanese Navy at Midway.
Good for you. Good for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you were at the Battle of Midway, but you didn't fly at the Battle of Midway.
No, sir, I did not fly, and how lucky I was that I didn't fly, because I think there was about 17 of our dive bombers out of our scouting squadron, SBD, and our dive bomber squadron that didn't make it back. So I could have easily been in one of those. Now, the reason why I didn't fly is because I wasn't senior enough. Most people don't realize it, but back in those days, we had what we called flight pay. Flight pay was extra dollars that you got every month for flying, for participating in flight crews. And it was a lot of competition because I was making, during the year of 1942, June 42, when the Battle of Midway took place, I was a aviation ordnanceman 3rd class, and I was making $60 a month. So now I was making $90 a month. And that was a big bunch of money back in those days. So everybody was competing to stay in flight status, and I wasn't senior enough to fly that month because I only got my flight pay maybe every 2 or 3 months apart. How lucky can I be?
Yes.
Yeah.
You were very lucky.
Yeah, so that's the way life was at that particular time.
Did you lose any of your good friends at the Battle of Midway, or did you have any friends on the...
Yes. It's quite a story, but we had a lot of confusion at the Battle of Midway in regards to what our dive bomber squadrons, bombing 6 and scouting 6, was going to do versus our fighter aircraft. And on the way down, they had a little confusion, and when they dove on the Hiryu, which was one of the Japanese carriers that was at Pearl Harbor and also at Midway, one of my close buddies was shot down. And what happened there was the Japanese had 20mm guns in the wings of their Zeros, and they closed on him just about the time they were getting ready to dive on the Hiryu. Here come a couple of Zeros, and they honed in on him, and they shot him down. And the rear seat gunner was a very good friend of mine, and his name was Hilbert. So we were programmed, my friends. We knew that we were out there to fight the war. Admiral Halsey always told us, you're out here to kill Japs, he says, and our job is to go find them and kill them. He says, we're going to lose our guys here, there, and everywhere, but we've got to do it.
Speaking of finding them, tell us the story about McCluskey and how he found the Japanese fleet.
Admiral McCluskey at the time was our air group commander, and he was relatively new at the job. We had lost our air group commander when we were blowing up the Marshall and Gilbert Islands back in February. So in June the 4th was Midway Day, 1942. McCluskey was an extremely honorable man, and he told us this story more than one time when we would have a reunion, a ship's reunion. And we'd always say, hey, Admiral, tell us the story again. And this is the story. We did not have a positioning report on the morning of June the 4th. We were waiting for somebody to tell us where the Japanese were located, and nobody did. We were up early. We had our aircraft loaded with bombs, ammunition, full of gasoline. The pilots were been up since 4 o'clock in the morning waiting to get the word, where are the Japanese fleet? Now, we knew they were out there, but you got to have a positioning report. Positioning report will tell you the longitude and the latitude, the number of ships, the types of ships, and what they're doing. But we had nothing. So finally, we got a report from a patrol bomber, PBY, and it was a positioning report. So the air group commander, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, gathered up all the dive bombers we had off the Enterprise, and he took off, and he had about 32 of them, and that's all we had. If we had lost that 32, we'd have been in deep, deep trouble. America would have been in deep, deep trouble, because we had no dive bombers to fight the Japanese with. So in the meantime, joining up with him was some of the SBD dive bombers off the Yorktown. So altogether, as I said, he had about 32 airplanes. So when he got over the spot that the positioning report indicated that the Japanese were there was nobody there, nothing there except the open sea. So he said, what do I do? And this is the way he talked. He says, what do I do? He says, if I go straight, where am I going? If I turn right, where am I going? However, if I turn left, I'll go to Midway, and they're blowing Midway up. I don't want to go there. And then he said he heard a little voice in his ear, and the little voice said, turn to the right. But due to the fact that he was having trouble with some of the other airplanes, or I should say the pilots were having trouble with some of the airplanes, oxygen trouble, and he was worried about getting down too low and not making a really coordinated attack. They were flying at 18,000 feet, so they dropped down to about 14, and then the gasoline needles on the gas gauges began to flicker, and do I have enough gas to find the Japs, blow them up, and then get back to the carrier? I don't know. And then he said, I heard this voice again, and the voice this time didn't waste any time, and it said, hey, turn to the right. So he turned to the right, and he run for a little while, and he looked down and he saw a ship, and he knew it was not a American ship. It had to be a Japanese fleet ship in that area. It looked like a light cruiser. So he said, I picked up its course, and I run its course for a few minutes, and then I stood up in my cockpit and pushed the nose over so I could look way, way ahead over the horizon. And he said there was 4 Japanese carriers. And those 4 Japanese carriers was a Akagi, which was the flagship, the Kaga, which was the sister ship, and he had the Hiryu, and there goes my Alzheimer's disease. There's another one.
Zokakyu.
Yeah, Zuikoku. No, the Zuikoku and the Shokoku were not there. They had been damaged in the Coral Sea battle. That was the Kaga and the Kaga, the Soryu.
Soryu.
Yeah. So there was the 4 Japanese carriers. So McCluskey ordered them on the way down, and you won't find this in history books. He told Dick Best, which was the squadron commander of Bombing 6, he says, you dive on the Akaga, and he says, I'll dive on the Akagi, and the rest of them will split them between the Hiryu and the Soryu, and they did. And I knew Lieutenant Best very well before he died. He said when he pushed over, he was at around 14,000 feet, and he pushed over and he was coming down about 240 miles an hour, 70 to 75 degrees, down like this. And he said he put his eye to the gun sight, and about that time he saw an instruction coming from the left side, and it was McCluskey with his dive bombers. And he said, I had to pull up. Now just think, this man's on target, coming down that speed at that angle, controlling that aircraft, and he's got to pull completely off a target and then get back on again. So when he got back on target, he was not over the Kaga like he was supposed to be. He was over the Kagi, and he had a pilot by the name of Ensign Kroger, or Lieutenant Kroger, and Ensign Weber flying wing on him. And those 3 guys sank the Akagi all by their lonesome self, and they hit them with 1,000-pound bombs. 1 midships, 1 aft, right smack in the middle of the flight deck, and the other one went through the edge of the flight deck and exploded in the water. And that was the end of the Akagi. Those same 3 pilots, they dove later on in the afternoon and they dove on the Huryu. And those 3 guys sank the Huryu. So just think, in the history of the United States Navy, 3 guys sank 2 Japanese aircraft carriers in the same battle.
In the same day.
In the same day, and it'll never be repeated again. There's no way it possibly could be. And
Mr. Wheeler, we're going to have to stop right here.
Yes,
we're going
sir.
to take a short break. Don't go away. We'll be back with more local heroes from the Battleship Alabama right after this. We're back talking with Mr. Chuck Wheeler. Mr. Wheeler, before the break we talked about the Battle of Midway and you being on the USS Enterprise. Now the Enterprise goes to some place called Guadalcanal. Tell us about the operation that you were involved with at Guadalcanal.
Guadalcanal, as far as the sailors were concerned, we had no idea where it was. I didn't know any of the officers that really knew where we were going, but we were told we were going to the South Pacific. And then when we got to the Tonga Islands and the ship tied up at Tonga Taboo, the Marines were already there with some transports and some Marines that were going to storm ashore at Tulagi, which was right across the bay from Guadalcanal. So we thought, so what, we'll go down there and do what we need to do. However, when we got there, it wasn't too long that we all realized that that the rear end, the rectum of the South Pacific was Guadalcanal. It was a terrible, terrible place to be, and a terrible, terrible place to go ahead and try to fight the war. Malaria, dengue fever, bugs of all types, creatures that would bite, rats, no matter where you went on those islands, this is what you had to contend with. So our Marines went ashore at Tulagi with very little opposition, and I was up on the flight deck watching them, and I could see them where our cruisers were blowing the place up. It was about like 10 o'clock in the morning, and we could see our dive bombers making runs on the airfield and the buildings and the supply dumps and whatever they had. So it was quite a show, and I remember sitting up on that flight deck watching what was going on, and then we got word that everything was going very easy for us, very, very easy. They had a little trouble at Tulagi, and the reason why they had trouble at Tulagi is because it had caves on it, plus the fact the Japanese had their Imperial Navy troops, which were highly skilled like our Marine Corps. And there was something like 1,800 of them on the island, and our Marines killed every one of them, down to the last man. And then I tell everybody, our Marines, without our Marines, we'd have still been fighting that war. However, they had a soft heart, and when I take people through the museum at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, the Aviation Museum, and I talk about the Marines, I tell them, without the Marines, we would have had a hard time, but they had a soft part in their heart. There was some women and children that were on the island of Tulagi, and our Marines took care of them. They erected tents for them, and they found food for them, and they made peace talks with the powers to be of the Japanese Navy to take them home. And I thought, I can't believe that they would do that, but that's the way our Marines were. So we really won the war in Guadalcanal. We lost the Wasp, and well, first I'll go back and I'll include the Battle of the Coral Sea as far as Guadalcanal, because it was all the same area. We lost the Lexington at the Coral Sea battle. That was our first line aircraft carrier, and then we lost the Yorktown at Midway, and then the next one was the Wasp. The Wasp was a little bit smaller than the Hornet or the Enterprise, and she was refueling, of all things, and Japanese submarine commander, extremely skillful, hit her with 3 torpedoes, and before you know it, she's completely on fire, and she's on the way to the bottom. And I have friends, not many of them left, but one of them tells this story. He said, after realized that the ship was sinking, they had abandoned ship, and everybody had supposedly a job to do, throw everything over the side that would float, get all the life rafts and pitch them over the side that would float, pieces of wood, you name it, so the guys could hang on to it. And he said they had everything in the water, and then they got word to abandon ship and get in the water, so they tied hawsers to the deck, and the guys slid down the hawsers. But he said before they slid down the hawsers, most all of them took their shoes off, and they lined the shoes up very carefully in line, because they said, we're not going to let the Wasp sink. We're going to come on back and we'll need our shoes. And of course, everything went down with the Wasp. Then we lost the Hornet. What makes it extremely interesting about the Hornet, I was up on the flight deck, and we had launched our aircraft looking for the Japanese, and this is when we were looking for the Zuikaku and the Shokaku. Japanese first line pilots, their best, the best they had, most skillful they had. So we were looking for them, and our radar picked up incoming enemy aircraft, and I was up on the flight deck, just behind the island structure, and I looked on up and I saw the Japanese aircraft approach the Enterprise, but they flew directly over the top of the Enterprise, and I didn't realize it, but we were in a rain squall, and they couldn't see us. But I could look up and I could tell the difference. They were low enough, I could tell the difference between the dive bombers and the torpedo bombers and the fighters. And one of the dive bombers made a dive bombing run, broke ranks and made a dive bombing run, and I think it was the North Dakota. It was one of either the South Dakota, at that time we had the Carolinas, South Carolina, or North Carolina, and the Dakota, and I don't remember which one of our battleships was, but he come on down and he dropped his bomb, and it hit the #1 turret, and it exploded, and that's where it killed the captain and some of the crewmen that were up on the bridge. You probably read about it.
Yes.
Yeah. And I thought to myself, I wonder if he ever got away, because I watched him completely. He just come on down, dropped the bomb, and then took off. So he probably survived. He didn't have any reason to dive on the Hornet, because he didn't have any any armament. So we watched him. I watched him dive on the Hornet, and I had a very, very close friend aboard the Hornet, and here's what he said. He said the Hornet took more bombs, more torpedoes, more damage than any other carriers that were sunk during the war. And he tells the story. He was a very brave guy, and he got the Silver Star during the Battle of Santa Cruz. And he was aboard the Hornet. And this is what he said. He said, I was up on the flight deck, and I saw this Japanese dive bomber come on down, and he didn't drop his bomb, and everybody kept thinking, he's going to drop that bomb, but he never did. And he crashed just alongside the bridge on the island structure. It disintegrated the aircraft, but the bomb went through the flight deck. And the next deck down was the O1 decks, and the bomb lodged on the O1 deck. So he said the chief come to him and told him, hey, McFetrich, you go on in there and see what you can do with that bomb. And I said, well, why didn't you tell the chief to go do it? And he said, the chief told me to do it, and I said, how about you coming with me? And he said, no.
I don't blame him.
So in the meantime, McFetrich went in that compartment. He had to go down a long passageway, and there was armories on both sides of the passageway, and he found out where the bomb was. It was right up by one of the officers' ready rooms, and it was rolling around, so he tied it up. And then he was going to take the fuse out of it, but the Japanese had a fuse. It was a booby-trap fuse. If you tried to take it out, it would blow up, and it was crushed anyway. So he said they tied it on up, and then after the battle, he and a couple of guys drug it, and then they had to take it up a short ladder, and they threw it over the side. So he got the Silver Star for bravery, and I used to ask him in years, what good did that Silver Star do you? And I didn't know, but it'd give him another $10 or $15 a month on his retirement. And I said, just think of all the beer you could buy with that 15 bucks. And I said, I never got turkey, and you wind up with 15 bucks worth of beer every month. But anyway, that was his story. But he was a real brave guy. He went on and got into a patrol bomber squadron. And believe it or not, he saw an Emily one day, and he was the nose gunner with the 250 calibers. And they come up behind the Emily, and he shot the thing down. But they wouldn't even give him an air medal. They were pretty stingy with giving their enlisted personnel air medals and Silver Stars and things like that.
We're going to have to stop right there, Mr. Wheeler.
Yes, sir.
Because we've come to the end of the show, but we're going to do another one.
Yeah.
So join us next week for another Local Heroes with Mr. Chuck Wheeler. Thank you for watching this edition of Local Heroes here on WKFK DTV7, where each week we bring you a story about a veteran, unedited, unchanged, and in their own words. So join me again next week here on WKFK DTV7, or visit our website at WKFK.com for archive shows about local heroes.